Now, I'm going to give you one more definition. The reason why I'm setting this up is not a modern political commentary. It really isn't. You have to understand these concepts to understand what's going to happen between World War I and World War II. You understand that? That's what this is all about.
I remember when after World War I, Germany got poor.
Yes. But what we're really going to look at eventually is the Soviet Union. So what is the difference
Didn't they have a civil war?
between, yes.
Like right after World War I, there was like a civil war. And then
We'll talk about that. Yes.
I think it falls in.
During World War.
Or yeah.
What's the difference between socialism and communism?
Communism, I think isn't like the president is in charge of everything. Yes.
Like most.
Okay, it's very close. You guys aren't too bad, but remember this is what we call a spectrum. Right? What is a spectrum? Yeah, so there's kind of like a graduation between one side to the other, extreme one, extreme the other. So we know socialism and communism both have the same idea: no private property, and the government should own the means of production. The difference here is that socialism is under democracy, and communism is under a dictatorship. Now, the reason why this is a spectrum is that if your democracy gets to be very, very highly regulated, if government begins to regulate everything, then what happens?
Then it turns into
Then it turns into a dictatorship. Does that make sense? Because that's the goal, is that, so it's a spectrum. So if we look here at this big spectrum below, we can say no government regulation and all government regulation. And if we look at that type of a spectrum, we could see way over here, we have something called libertarianism. And libertarianism is a theory, but it's not practical. So someone explain what that means. 'Cause just looking at this spectrum, what does that mean to be a libertarian? Looking at what we zero government regulation whatsoever. And some people think, oh, that's capitalism. No, no. True libertarian means no government. And this, I say, is a theory because it assumes that the invisible hand is so strong that people will just be able to get along with each other, because if they don't, they'll have natural consequences. The problem, the reason why this is a theory, is that frankly, it denies human nature. Right? And what are some of the things of human nature? How about greed? How about anger? How about revenge? Sometimes I'm willing to actually lose a ton just to be mean to that guy because he upset me one time. So the idea that the invisible hand will take care of society never works. So what we call this, because it's not practical, we give this a term called utopian. And this refers to a book a long time ago, and I think I mentioned it to you guys, the guy Thomas More. This is right around the time that the modern nation states are rising. Thomas More was actually killed by Henry VIII. When Henry VIII said, I want to have a divorce, Thomas More was like the equivalent of like the prime minister. And Thomas More, a very strong Catholic, says, you can't just do that. You can't just steal all the church's land. You can't, you're not able to do this. And Henry VIII said, well, sure I am. And then he kills Thomas More. So there he is able to do it. It caused a great deal of unhappiness, and eventually this is what begins the path to the constitutionalism. It takes about 100 years. But he wrote a book called Utopia, where it's really kind of a satire. It's what a perfect society would be like. And what's very funny is that this perfect society is nothing like society under Henry VIII. So what does that tell you about Henry VIII? He's like the opposite of a good society. So we use the word utopia to describe a society that's perfect on paper, but not real. That's what the word utopia means. It's perfect on paper, but it denies actual human nature. It's not realistic. I'm mentioning that because on this other side is also utopian. Because it assumes that you can have all total government reaction, which means that there is no violations. The government controls everything. And so in this idea, this is called communism, right? And under communism, the theory is everybody owns, all own, all work, and so there is no need for government because we are all government. All are government. Now that sounds really funny, right? But what's the reality?
It's not.
Why?
Because people have different views of what should.
And some people are kind of natural leaders. Some people want that power. And so you don't have any possibility of having no government. And just because everybody shares equally, does that mean that they all are happy to share equally? No, it denies human nature. It denies the reality of human nature. Now, I won't get into this, except that both of these sides are atheist. These are modern Enlightenment ideas that come up with a human ideal of how to solve things. So utopian societies tend to be atheistic societies because it means that God has no role in life, which means that our human nature doesn't actually involve a soul or right or wrong. You're just talking about if everything is just economic, it's just about having access to goods. So these are the extremes. In between these extremes, then we have something called the free market, okay? And then we have something over here, which is, I'm going to use this word, revolutionary communism, because it's a little bit different from utopian communism, okay? And then in between these two guys, we have something called a welfare state. I don't know if you've heard that term before. And on this side, we have called socialism. What is a welfare state? Pretty much. That's right. Okay. So least government regulation, some government regulation, more government regulation, and then here most government regulation. And you can see it's a spectrum. So when you get to total government regulation, it's not very realistic. And I'll just give you an example. If you have a government that pretends to be total regulation, in other words, I'm going to set the prices on everything, the government's going to determine this, the government's going to own everything, you don't actually have any real property, what do you think actually happens?
Everybody's just making regulations anyway.
Yeah, it's called a black market. What is a black market?
Basically, anything
Anything
secretive.
that's not
Illegal.
regulated.
Yeah, it's illegal. And the funny thing here is that on this side, you actually have what's called a black government. This has nothing to do with color. It just means a shadow. In fact, that's what actually is more accurate because you actually know that term a little bit better. It's called the shadow government. What is a shadow government?
They're there, but they're not actually there.
There you go. So people do not recognize it, but they're actually arranging things. And so that's why they're both utopian, because that's what pops up. Now, where's the United States here?
Welfare state.
We are closer, probably around here. And that's where a lot of the debate. So this is an American history class, but clearly you have politician type folks that are pushing to go this direction. And you have politician folks that are pushing to go the other direction, right? We're not actually a socialist society. In fact, there are very few socialist democracies. People make example of, say, like Norway or Denmark, because they have socialized medicine. But Norway and Denmark are not socialist because their businesses are mostly unregulated. It's just that they put high taxes and they'll pay for certain types of things, but they won't own the government. You still have a free market. So the only examples where we have socialism are examples that have moved this way. Venezuela is an example. So we're also going to see other countries that are example. Germany will be an example between the wars. Okay? So you start off as a socialist society, which means it's democratic, but it doesn't take very long for it to become a dictatorship. Maduro is elected as a socialist. He completely takes over parts of the government, and then when he is elected out, voted out, what does he do? He stays in power, right? Because he moved from being a democracy to being a dictatorship. And that is most often what happens. The reason why I need to make this clear is that this is what we're going to see in those years between World War I and World War II. And especially in times when you have economic recessions, bad economies, there's a strong kind of a magnetism to socialism. Because if you're poor, what do you want? Things to be free, right? It makes sense, right? I want this free stuff. But what happens with that? There is another really big example that we saw in your class here. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
What, like the taxes and that?
How about France? Remember I mentioned there are two stages of the revolution?
Yeah.
The first revolution was really democratic. The second revolution really turned into something that was trying to be so more socialistic. And what did it lead to? The reign of terror. And irony of all irony, who gets appointed emperor within, say, 5 years? Napoleon, right? So it's a very easy transition. Now, this is background. This is understanding our vocabulary and understanding what it means. And unfortunately, when I mention our modern society, we use lots of these terms and we rarely know what they actually mean, right? But you guys will know what they mean. So when I use them, you won't be confused. Does that make sense? Okay.